Hello and welcome to World Talks with me, Ashim Kumar. Russia is escalating pressure on the Baltic states with legal threats, disinformation campaigns and warnings of strikes, while the United States reportedly plans to halve its deep strike capability in Europe, raising urgent questions about deterrence, NATO cohesion and regional security across the continent. Joining us is Rasmus Nilsson. He's lecturer of Slavic and East European Studies at the University College London. Mr. Nilsson, welcome to TVP World. Thanks for taking the time.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
Good evening. So things are hotting up when it comes to the rhetoric between the Baltic states and Russia. Give us your overview assessment of what's happening there.
Well, I think that very clearly Russia is doing poorly on the battlefield in Ukraine, so they're trying to change the focus, both for Putin to regain some posture at home, but also for him to try and see if he can distract Ukraine's European allies, including in the Baltics. These sorts of threats have been underlying the scene for quite a while now, effectively throughout the full-scale invasion. But it's coming up now because Russia is beginning to feel itself pushed into a corner.
Right, but it's playing the old tune of saying, well, Putin's given himself the legal authority to invade countries where there's what he calls an ethnic Russian population, which includes Latvia and Estonia in particular. Does that indicate an intention of invading, or is that still just distraction?
I think first and foremost, as I indicated before, this has a domestic audience. First and foremost, this is Vladimir Putin telling people at home, telling the elite at home in particular, that he is still in charge. Whether they believe him or not is a separate matter. I don't think, in terms of the Baltics, we should necessarily expect a direct Russian invasion anytime soon. What you might, of course, see are increased, what is known as so-called hybrid attacks, increased provocations, increased sort of subversive activities. That might happen, maybe minor sort of kinetic movements, but a full-scale attack, I'm not quite sure how Russia would do that. Right now, the Russian forces are trying to find a way to handle what they've got in Ukraine, and they're not handling it well.
Could this be, bearing in mind President Trump's threats of halving deep strike capabilities in Europe, could this be seen by Putin as an opportunity to test NATO's resilience, by doing provocations in the Baltics to see what would happen with a much depleted military base in Europe?
It might be, although it should be said that the Russians are becoming a bit concerned about the erratic movements from the Americans overall. Having said that, and looking at the broader picture of American engagement in Europe, and you sort of alluded to it in the beginning today, I think Europe should be, and I think European leaders are, becoming used to the thought that unfortunately we probably shouldn't calculate too much on having American backing in the medium to longer term future. Whether that means that Putin will then try and see what the rest of NATO can do, that is possible. But again, I would be surprised if that was tested through some sort of full-scale attack, not least because the Russians right now are not really in a position to do that. But smaller-scale provocations, maybe sending in some explosives here or there, that is possible, absolutely, and the Baltics have to be aware of that.
Right. Well, they are becoming aware in the diplomatic sense by strongly condemning, the foreign ministers of all three Baltic states strongly condemning Russia's attacks on civilian targets in Ukraine. Do you think that's going to make a difference? What does it indicate to you?
I mean, it's not going to make a difference right now in terms of getting the Russians to stop or making them feel bad about themselves. But what it might do, and where it is important, apart from showing solidarity as we continue to have to do to the Ukrainians so they know we've got their back, it's also a matter of reminding ourselves, the Baltics reminding the rest of the world, that once this fighting is over through an armistice or something more durable, then Russia cannot simply be normalized again. Russia cannot simply be pulled back into normal business and political affairs. There has to be some sort of reckoning, and that will take time. Every time you have the protests from the West, including now from the Baltics, then that is a reminder that Russia cannot simply get back into what I would call civilization, bluntly.
Right. Now, let's move to Ukraine. Russia has warned foreigners, foreign diplomats, to leave the country because, as Foreign Minister Lavrov said to Senator Rubio, there's going to be a systematic bombing of Kyiv, and he wants diplomats to leave. Ursula von der Leyen of the European Union and the leaders of the Baltic states have said, no, we're not going. How do you see that dynamic?
Well, I've got no doubt that the Russians will throw what they can at population centers like Kyiv in Ukraine. They've done that many times before. They will do it again. I don't think they will necessarily aim for foreigners there or aim for foreign diplomats, but of course people can absolutely get hit by the explosions, by the debris and so on. The Russians are saying this because they're once again trying to create a divide between Ukraine and its Western allies. It's trying to show Ukrainians and Russians that Ukraine stands alone. Well, good on von der Leyen and good on the Western governments that are saying, no, we're not listening to this. Stop bombing, get out of Ukraine. That is absolutely the right message to send.
Yes, but it would be a major diplomatic incident, wouldn't it, if a foreign diplomat were to be killed or injured by Russian fire, drones or missiles. You think Putin is really prepared to take that risk?
Take the risk, yes, I do believe he's prepared to do that. Again, targeting specifically, and I know you didn't say that, but targeting foreigners specifically, no. But taking the risk, absolutely. And once you hit civilian centers, like Kyiv, there are quite a few foreigners there, including foreign diplomats, they can end up in harm's way. Putin is perfectly prepared to take that risk, absolutely. And if it happens, he would then say, as he did in, of course, much wider conflagration in terms of Westerners back with the shooting down of MH17 in 2014, he will say effectively, if he acknowledges Russia has killed the foreigners here, he will say, well, it's a shame, but that's what happens in war. We did warn you. The Russian government is not going to be scared off, even if there is such a diplomatic incident, I'm afraid.
Okay, well, we touched on the United States being an unreliable NATO ally. Is Europe ready to fill the breach if they were to remove 50% of their equipment from Europe?
Overnight, no, but we've got to get there, and we've got to get there as fast as we can. Now, I have, and I'm sure you and your listeners have as well, many times heard the argument that it's unrealistic to imagine a NATO handling its affairs without the US. Well, I'm going to argue that it is unrealistic to imagine a NATO in the medium to longer term future, a NATO that has a significant American backing. I would absolutely prefer America to stay in and to stay focused on NATO under Trump and afterwards. But I must admit, we've got to look at the signals coming out from Washington. And just to be clear, even if Trump were to go away today, I'm not sure that another American government, be that Republican or Democratic, would necessarily reverse course and become fully involved in Europe again. So are we prepared today to fill in for what the Americans would pull out? No, but we've got to get there as soon as possible. That requires increased military-industrial coordination within the European NATO members plus Canada, and it requires us to prepare the populations of Europe for the financial sacrifices that this takes. This is a longer-term investment, and we've got to get used to the fact that the Americans, with or without Trump, are beginning to go elsewhere.
Yes, Mr. Nilsson, I mean, of course, that makes perfect logical sense, but if you zoom out and look at the geopolitical reality globally, this is pretty good news for China and Russia, is it not, that they've separated the United States from Europe, and therefore both are easier to handle, aren't they?
Yes, there is some point to that. And again, I would absolutely prefer it if the Americans stayed involved in the longer term in European hard security affairs. I'm just sort of trying to adjust to what I see as the reality now. Now, in terms of what the Chinese and the Russians would want, for the Russians, certainly it's good news, but the Russians are having significant problems handling Ukraine on its own. So for the Russians, it may be good news, but it may not be decisive news. In terms of the Chinese overall would like the war in Ukraine to stop so they can get back to getting a secure Belt and Road Initiative across Eurasia, and so that they could get back to concentrating on East Asia. China is playing a peculiar game right now. On the one hand, yes, they have definitely given significant help to Russia in this war, but they are also concerned about what can happen in a Russia that becomes increasingly less domestically stable. Now, on the one hand, that can give opportunities for Chinese businesses and so on. On the other hand, it can create a bit of a problem the Chinese have to deal with along their northern border. So the Chinese, although they are certainly helping the Russians, they don't want this war to drag out for years and years more. That is not in their interest.
Well, that's as may be, but they do want the ability to deal with America and Europe separately, which is, it seems, what they're going to have if this continues the way it is.
Sure, absolutely. But the way the Chinese will be going around this, certainly in terms of European affairs, is to try and get as involved in European economies as they possibly can. And whether we think that's a good idea or not, you can just have a look at the European governments pretty much throughout Europe and see how Europe has welcomed this in practice, if not always rhetorically. Now, in the longer term, that means that the Chinese can be, should the Chinese end up in a direct confrontation with the Americans, if they are sufficiently tied into Europe, they might hope that Europe then will stay on the sidelines of any sort of serious Chinese-American clash. I'm not sure Europe would do that, but that's what the Chinese are betting on. If we don't want to end up in that boat, then we shouldn't do that many deals as we are with the Chinese. But it looks like that is the way Europe right now, or most European countries, have chosen.
Well, yes, and of course Taiwan comes to mind when it comes to Chinese interests and the response of the US and perhaps Europe as well. Mr. Nilsson, thank you very much indeed for sharing your analysis with our audience. Have a good evening.
Same to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye now. And brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away. Lots more coming up. Goodbye.